Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and today I am here with the busiest thumbnail of all time, the busiest Darth Maul shirt of all time, and it's all because I am so excited about the potential for a Warcry FAQ coming with the announced Horns of Hashut FAQ sort of rules download, as at least what they promised us. Now, there's no guarantee that an FAQ comes with this, but I can't imagine they would release a PDF of the Horns of Hashut for Warcry without giving us some sort of attention for the rest of the game. And under that assumption, I am very excited about it, and I can't help but kind of think about what would be cool to see, where the state of the game is right now, and kind of what the underlying structures of the game are that I don't really get to talk about enough in videos, but I think is worth thinking about if you're someone who, plays a bit of this game and is someone who is interested in as the temperature changes on different fighters, different things, specific game pieces, what that can create and what sort of ripple effects you can see. And I think the way to start thinking about this is thinking about what's been good in Warcry. And there's really four things that have been good at different times during Warcry's existence. And it's pretty much always either been the best big thing, the best little thing, the best gun, or the best ability. And it's usually, the first three. Seeing the best ability dominate is rare, but often when it is paired with something solid. So, for example, when Fight for Profit was paired with Aether Cannons, and that was incredibly efficient. That was really annoying. Or, when Dragon Maul was paired with chimeras that were already ridiculously efficient. That creates a problematic situation, right? Most of the time in Warcry, though, these three, the best gun, the best little thing, and the best big thing have been the key to finding out, what are the best things to try to do if you want to try to win your games. And it's going to depend on, the mission pack, the way deployments are set up in various games you're going to play, the relative strength of these things. But pretty much at every time in Warcry's history, if you started things off by trying to figure out what the answer to one of these three questions was, and then go and try to leverage that as much as you possibly can, you were usually going to do really well. And I imagine that'll probably be true after this FAQ, but I think it's an open question of whether or not we can make it so that something else other than these three things is the best thing in the game, and that would be really cool to see as well. Ideally, whatever the best thing in the game is, I'm not someone who believes, for example, that balance exists or is even something you want. You could have a symmetrical game like chess, and yes, it would be balanced, but I would not be particularly interested in that game. And I like asymmetrical games, which means that some game pieces are going to be more valuable than other game pieces. Some game pieces, especially if you're allowed to bring a list, and I really like list building, some game pieces are going to be more exploitable in list building than others. But in my view, the ideal metagame is something where the best thing in the game is A, hard to identify, B, has counterplay, and C, changes over time and even with particular, missions and setups. And so when I think about, what kinds of adjustments we could see GW make and what we would like to see GW make, it generally goes to buffs, nerfs, and side grades if we're being reductive here. And I think generally when I'm talking about side grades, I'm talking about things like GW creating the Dark Oath faction out of whole cloth, out of some profiles that are a lot like Slaves to Darkness ones, and then some new models and things like that. Sort of new creations that they've done in their FAQs have been really excellent, and I expect them to continue to be excellent. Things like, for example, a lot of their best rules writing has been in the Underworld's Warband rules that they've added to Warcry, which I have other issues with that. I don't think that that's healthy for the game at all. But that is where their best rules writing is right now, which is very interesting. And it's certainly something where it seems like the most recent rules they write tend to be the best ones as they've kind of learned how the game is played over time. And so I'm pretty excited about that. It's something that makes me very excited to pick up this new Hashut faction. I think whatever they figure out for it is going to be pretty interesting. Um, but what I think I'm sort of more trepidatious about, but also very interested in, is how they'll do kind of nerfs and buffs aimed at both the competitive scene, hopefully, and also hopefully sort of the casual LGS scene. That is something that I think that I don't know if GW really is as aware of what goes down in, just like average sort of casual games or not. It's kind of hard to pick that up necessarily from kind of posts on Reddit and Facebook or things like that. Whereas, we have competitive data, it's really easy for them to figure that out. And there's a few different ways I like to think about these things. One is making buffs and nerfs based on the underlying structure of the game. Things that are quite generally a problem, like lethality or hordes or recycling abilities. Versus things that are kind of broad strokes leads to you having a bad time. Things like Chaos Warriors or Elves, or trying out control abilities that don't revolve around nets. Or you could also say that nets themselves they're like a third tier problem in the metagame, but they are just like, it's so weird that nets are a really playable version of control, but anything other than that isn't. And so that's the only way we're interacting with our opponents in this game. It's just a very strange thing to be happening, right? Then the second way you can kind of think about these buffs and nerfs are as specific faction tweaks. So things like Wildercore and kind of the Soupy Destruction lists, and then Skaven, Slanesh, and then also Soupy Death, basically death lists that start with Underworlds fighters. Versus, the very worst factions like the two Khorne ones, the Elves, and the last four factions like Pyrogeists, Tyraddic, Riverblades, and Twistwell. And you can think about these in a few different ways, and I think it's worth using both lenses when thinking about, what would be cool to see out of some changes. And to give you some examples, when we talk about structural nerfs, or when I talk about structural nerfs, because there is no we here, nobody else talks about this other than me. And I don't really make videos on this topic very often. The biggest one is Warcry's kind of lethality explosion. The amount of killiness that has come ever since we first got Divine Blessings. Now, Divine Blessings are kind of a cool little shtick to put onto list building. I preferred list building before they were there, but they give you tools that let people fantasize that their terrible, unplayable models will be playable again. And those people are all wrong because, and this is something I tried to tell people from the beginning, but it took people a while to understand, and that's okay. Basically, because gaming is zero sum, if your model isn't the model that gets the very most out of Divine Blessings, then even if you think that your model is sort of better or more interesting because it's getting blessed, it's actually losing ground. It's starting here to there, and then it comes up to here, but the thing that was up here goes way up to here, and so you've actually lost ground, is essentially what happens if these aren't costed perfectly. One of the things I find pretty sad now in list building is any fighter that's kind of medium, where it has like not a ton of attacks, but not very low attacks. The attacks deal some damage, but not, a ton per attack. The strength isn't 6, and it's also not 3. Those fighters just don't get much out of being blessed, and I think that's too bad, right? Because those fighters have all become bad in a way that they weren't all terrible before, but they're all really bad now because none of them sort of leverage a blessing well, and I just think that's too bad. Now, that I think is a way lower on the priority list kind of structural change than just kind of the lowest hanging fruit here. And what I'm talking about is the effects of +1 attack. For 25 and 30 points, depending on the wounds of your fighter, you can get absolutely massive boosts to your efficiency on points per DPA 5, so damage per activation against toughness 5. And yes, there are better metrics than damage per activation for list building specifically, like what is the thing I'm trying to kill? What gives me the best percentage chance to kill the thing I'm worried about killing? Um, but in terms of broad strokes, I think it illustrates a lot. So, for example, a Gut Lord goes from costing 290 points and giving you, you're paying 23.2 points per damage against T5 to it goes up, yes, to 320 points, but it gets more efficient because the damage goes up by so much, and you then get to 19.2. Annihilator Prime goes 21.4 to 19.7. Axgergan Exemplar 22.7 to 19.2. Vexmore from the unacceptable 37.2 to 21.6. Vexmore is not quite as efficient as these others, but Vexmore has other things that is very good. Vexmore is incredibly tough for the points, and Vexmore has range 2, and Vexmore levels up even more from Onslaught than these ones do. So I gave these 4 examples because they're in all 4 Grand Alliances, so that you can see here that each Grand Alliance is capable of incredible lethality. If you also look at, other things that, say, for example, Nighthaunt can do when they're using their triple, right? Or, a lot of factions can do that have charge doubles. There's just a lot of killiness in the game right now, and a lot of it wasn't there before Divine Blessings came. Yes, there were Brugits, and Brugits added a lot of killiness, but there's real counterplay to an opponent having a Brugit. Whereas what's going on right now with Divine Blessings, there's really a lot less counterplay to. A big part of that is because a lot of the fighters that leverage the +1A buff the best already have really high strength. So upgrading to your toughest fighters, for most factions, that won't matter. Most factions don't go any tougher than toughness 5. So they actually don't have any counterplay to all of these ridiculously damage efficient strength 6 fighters. Because that's really the only way to combat them, is to get up to strength 6 or to toughness 6. And, like I said, most factions can't do that. So that's very much an issue. It's an issue that kind of covers the entire game. Most Grand Alliances have a bunch of other fighters that go crazy with the +1A blessing, aside from just these ones. And there are lots of solutions to this. And I'm not particularly worried about which one they do in an FAQ, but I would like to see something. One is you could just nerf +1 attack in and of itself. I think, for example, putting it at 30 and 40 would just really help. 30 and 45 would be nice as well. Or you can kind of nerf the fighters who best utilize it. Gutlord and Vexmore go crazy with it more than any other fighters do, for example. Or you can kind of do a mix of both. You could do a small nerf for +1A and then another small nerf for just the worst offenders for +1A. That's probably the approach I like the best, although it would take the most work, and I get that not everyone wants to do a lot of work. And then once that happens, you kind of get to have a conversation of whether or not you want second level nerfs. So, for example, Pounce doubles are very effective and can create a ton of damage. So Wielder of the Blade, Clawbacks, Slake Slash, whether or not you want to kind of nerf these or not is a real philosophical question of how much do you want to really curb lethality. Personally, I think that if you are sort of nerfing one thing, you should let the next thing have its time in the sun. But if you are just nervous about curbing lethality in general, for example, if you want elves to be good, you're going to need to sort of drop down some of these, especially, Wielder of the Blade, crit hit, nothing else. Like crit hit, miss from Clawback, Slake Slash, and Wielder um, still kills an elf, right? And so if you are worried about that, you would want to sort of nerf these as well. I personally wouldn't do it, but if GW did, I wouldn't think that that was weird at all. I'd kind of take it as a really interesting statement from their end, and that's kind of cool to think about. The next kind of structural nerf that I think is worth looking at is hordes and recycling. Um, because of the kind of mechanics of Warcry, I've said this in videos for years now, going back to first edition, but the very basic mechanics of Warcry push you towards only taking really big and really little things. So, for example, most abilities are force multipliers, and so they have higher impact on big things. So, you want a big thing in your list. But then an activation has its own value. So, even one move, one wound, one attack for 1/1 damage, even that fighter would be worth some points. And so you really do need to think about sort of how much the efficiency goes up at the two ends, goes up at the lowest end and at the highest end. And so this graph, not all of these have a ton of reps here. I think 3 models has only been taken once, which is why it's at exactly 75. But you can see that, on the very edges of skew, there is a lot, there's a lot of win rate there. And that's part of it, is because really small warbands and really big warbands have their own kind of skewed power to them that is very difficult for people to deal with, and is going to be incredibly powerful in a lot of situations. But once you get to more reasonable medium numbers and numbers that have a lot more players playing those numbers, you can see a pretty interesting trend, in my opinion, which is that the more models you run, the more games you win. Who would have thought, right? And that's because hordes are just too good right now. So, in the same way that it's too easy to kill things, when you have lots of things to kill, you generally do better. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule. So, for example, I think Cruel Boys is probably the second best faction in the game, and they have a really hard time running more than 9 models. And it is interesting that 8 here gets a little bump. I wonder if that's because every good Cruel Boys list has 8 models. I'm sure it's more than that, but they get to have sort of specific weapons against hordes in terms of being able to ally in a brute boss. That can really help you against a horde. But generally, the more models you run, the better you're going to do. And I think that's really interesting. Chaff in general in this game has sort of ran the game for a long time. Personally, I actually think that's mostly because of how bad Chaos Warriors are. And when I say Chaos Warriors, I don't just mean specifically Chaos Warriors, I mean all their equivalents. All the bespoke warbands are based around like Prey Takers and Proven from Dark Oath, or Pit Fighters from Spire Tyrants, or just like all of these will have a 120 to 145 point sort of thick human who is supposed to be this kind of specialist who fights stuff, and all of them to a fighter are all terrible, and they're supposed to be the thing that clears out all the chaff efficiently, right? Because if one of those fighters kills 2 chaff models, it's achieved something pretty cool. It's sort of justified its points, and in theory, it's supposed to be very good at doing that. The problem is they just cost too many points. You can't put enough of them on the board to actually expect to get your points back. And you just get kind of overwhelmed by activation advantage and you lose. And the other problem is that they get cleared off in one shot by really big scary things, and so you're just better off flooding the board with a ton of dudes. So generally, I think that this graph kind of shows to me that fighters below 50 points are probably never safe. And I also think that's generally true of being able to resurrect things. I think full full health res is just kind of unsafe at any speed. Right now, for example, the Arc zombies from Exiled Dead are just far too efficient. Being able to fully res the 15 health one is just insane to me, the fact that you can do that. And it's incredibly powerful. Spiders, of course, are kind of legendary for being able to do it. Pack Masters from Skaven have been a real problem. And so, full health res and just hordes in general are just really unsafe when they're in really extreme amounts. So, fighters below 50 points should probably all be looked at to see if they could be a problem. Like right now in Cruel Boys, we play Stab Grots because they facilitate what everything else does. And one of the reasons why Cruel Boys is so good, even though they only run 8 fighters, is because 2 of those fighters are these tiny, cheap Stab Grots that go below 50 points. Ogres usually runs like 9 fighters, and it's like 5 of them are Noblars, which are these 45-point Noblars. So the more access you have to cheap bodies, the better off you're going to be. And that's part of why the higher numbers tend to do better, is because of what's happening there. I think that there's a lot that you could look at here, and a lot that I'd be happy with, as long as it looks like GW knows that this is an issue. I don't want to get hordes out of the game. I actually think that horde playstyles are fun. Most of the time when I play Warcry, I play 10 models because I really like what you can do with a 10 model list, and the kinds of the kind of push and pull you can have of still being able to fit some really intense offense in there while still having a lot of bodies. The way you're able to, choose which deployment is your 4 model deployment to kind of steal the thunder of the really high bodies lists, because all of a sudden they don't get really any real activation advantage on you if you choose your deployment wisely. 10 models is my favorite number to play at, right? So 10 models is kind of horde adjacent. I would say it really starts at 11. But that's just to say that I really don't want these things to go away. Horde needs to exist, but then I would love to see changes by GW that show that they're really sure which factions should rely on their chaff and how those factions can be playable but not busted. So, for example, Soulblight is a faction that should rely on their chaff. Nurgle Demons is a faction that should rely on their chaff, right? When you think about Nurgle Demons, you think about sort of swaths of these swampy plague bearers shambling around. Same is true for Soulblight, right? But then you have to think about, which chaff is balanced and which ones isn't. What's that supposed to look like? I think, when Soulblight, the best Soulblight lists generally will have like 2 zombies, and then the rest is all Underworlds fighters, because, you can do things like exploit the Exiled Dead's ability to still be full health resable, but now be move 4 and beyond, just like a very wild points algorithm in terms of how efficient they are. I'd love to just see a just slightly more nuanced take on which chaff should be defining the kind of cheap flood factions in the game. And then for the ones that are purposefully not having as good of chaff, what are the things that we can buff elsewhere in the list to make them more interesting? It might even be that, the perfect FAQ doesn't have huge nerfs for hordes, but instead has big buffs for anti-horde abilities. We've seen now 2 different nerfs to Horns of Hashut, so I'm not holding my breath for that anytime soon. But I'm just bringing it out there to say that there's a lot of different fixes for this, and again, just wishing for to see one of them. It would just be very nice to see every Grand Alliance to have real counterplay to hordes, whether that's something like the Brute Boss, or whether that's some other ability that's on other heroes that are allyable around the factions that you can sort of bring into any Grand Alliance. That's something that I would just love to see, but we're wish listing here. As far as faction nerfs, we can go through these. These are, I think, less interesting, but very much more sort of achievable and easy to talk about. So Wielder Core, Crossbows are the second best fighter in the game, and they're spammable. So in some ways, they're the best fighter because the best fighter in the game isn't spammable. Um, Whether or not you think this is a structural issue can kind of be up to you. Whether or not shooting should be good in Warcry, I think that it should be. I think that you know having a way to punish someone who is trying to not engage is really important. You don't want the world where there is no shooting in the game, because then the only thing that can win is either the thing that doesn't fight or the thing that is best at fighting, and that's not good. So you want things to exist in the game that force opponents to kind of play dynamically and play with multiple plans in mind. But it's just not a coincidence that the best shooting in the game has always been good. And, I think we can tamp that down a little bit. Wildercore is also cool because once crossbows get nerfed, Wildercore has so many awesome stuff that you can do, whether it's, having weird tricks with their melee guys, whether it's having their arbalesters. There's lots of cool things that Wildercore can do, whether it's the doggy build. The doggy build is really good. Whatever it is you want to do in Wildercore, it could really shine a lot more if crossbows were nerfed a little bit. Cruel Boys, Shank is the best fighter in the game. Make Shank 65 points, please. Shank, you can't spam Shank, which is really good because otherwise you would just start every list with 3 Shanks and that would just be broken. But the fact that his net is on a 2-up is just absurd. I think that nets are kind of their own little problem in the game. They're just really low on the list of priorities, and so I wouldn't want people to really mess with them now. But if we kept getting FAQs, even if it's just yearly, nets need to be brought into line eventually. Skaven, the way the battle trait interacts with Packmaster Roger combo is just unhealthy. The way you sort of play around the Packmaster Roger combo should be that you put a little bit of damage onto the Roger and you drop the Packmaster, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. The problem is that you kill the Packmaster and the Packmaster comes back and then whips the Roger again, and you're back where you started. And so the battle trait is absurd. The fact that they don't have to spend any dice on it, any resources at all. If you want to keep the battle trait, because it is legitimately one of the most cool, flavorful things they've done, you have to just make Packmasters bad. That's it. Or just make them 75 points, and then even then, Skaven are still really good. But there's just a lot that they need that needs doing there. Slaanesh is a really interesting one. Blissbrew Homunculi might be too good at only 55 points, but I think that's debatable. I think the real thing is that they just synergize with Vexmore so well. Both versions do. So Slaanesh Demons, because Vexmore can be the leader, doesn't take up an ally slot. You get to kind of choose what else you put in there. Demonettes are terrible, and yet, Slaanesh Demons still do well because of Vexmore. And then Slaanesh Humans is just like the perfect synergy with Vexmore, because Slake Slash is so good at killing the things that Vexmore is uniquely bad at killing. So Slake Slash counts to 12 very, very efficiently and consistently, and Vexmore counts to every relevant number other than 12 very, very efficiently. So it's this incredible synergy duo between the two of them, and it makes them very, very busted. And so, Slaanesh, the thing that would worry me is if we see a lot of nerfs to Slaanesh other than Vexmore. That would make me sad, because I think that Slaanesh Demons would go to being terrible if Vexmore was more balanced. That would happen very, very quickly. So they do need to get touched. Vexmore is an issue. I'm curious to see if Blissbrews would be an issue again after Vexmore is nerfed. I kind of don't think they will be, because they weren't an issue before, but a lot of the things that do what Blissbrews do better than them have been nerfed, so maybe they would stand out a little bit more since those things aren't as good now. Royal Beast Flayers has been under the radar in terms of their power level, but they have won in a variety of hands. It's not just something that 2 people worked on, did well with, and then put down anymore. It's now something where a lot of people have done very well with Royal Beast Flayers. Their win rate is really, really high, but how much does that have to do with Ferocious Gnarlwood 2? That is a pack that gets played in the UK a lot. Most of the Royal Beast Flayers performances that are really good are in the UK. It's probably to do with the fact that Royal Beast Flayers is ridiculous in Ferocious Gnarlwood too. So how much you want to nerf that or not is really up to you. And I could respect any kind of different approach to that, just because of where they're at. Now I want to talk about buffs and structural buffs, because this is my biggest hobby horses in the game and I find them really fascinating. So defensive elites and offensive chaff have been kind of difficult to use all throughout second edition. So the problem with aggro chaffs, and the reason why witch elves are worse than homunculi or RBF ghouls, right? It's not a move 5 problem. It's a defensive chaff versus offensive chaff problem. So with Royal Beast Flayers, the chaff isn't playing offense. The chaff is waiting and then moving up, taking space, and then the leader plays offense by using the chaff to proc an ability. That's very different than witch elves needing to get into combat, right? Because then they're in combat, they cost a lot of points at 65 points. They need to get those points back by dealing damage. And yes, 65 is cheap, but I mean for cheap chaff, that's really expensive. Same with Namarti Thralls at 80 points for being T3 8 wounds, right? Namarti Thralls need to get into combat, and when they do, they fall down real quick. And so it's like, if you think of your cloud, your 240 point sort of group of 4 Namarti Thralls as a big fighter and how much damage it can do, it seems very efficient at first, right? But it brackets. The damage comes in little bits, so you get 1 bit off, and then you lose a bit before it applies. So then you really only get, 3 of your 4 bits off in the first round, and then only 1 of your 4 bits off usually in the second round, and then you're gone. Compare that to, say, a Gut Lord doing damage, where it deals its whole damage, all the ogres do, until you've done 30 plus wounds to it. So your Namarti Thralls are not just one 24 wound fighter that deals, what would it be, 16 attacks per thing, right? You can't really think of it that way because of the way their damage goes down when they die. So basically, they're not scoring points as effectively as the defensive chaff. They're usually not surviving as long as the defensive chaff, even though they cost more points. And they're not as good at killing as elites are because of the way their damage brackets down. So just the math on aggro chaff right now is really, really bad. There's a few different ways that you could try to fix that. Points would help. So for example, I think witch elves at 60 points would be really good. You could also give them abilities. That's really difficult because you'd really have to give the abilities probably to the leaders, and there's only a few different things that could really make them good, right? So for example, we've proven that pack tactics and kill is a really good way to weaponize chaff. It makes dogs and ghouls really, really good. But you can't just clone that ability for every single offensive chaff faction in the game. And it's just not flavorful for witch elves and Namarti Thralls and, demonettes and, the vampire chaff from Askergen. What are they? I can't remember their names, but those little vampires in the Askergen Trueblades that are also basically elves. All those offensive chaff pieces, they need some other kind of interesting way to kind of get their damage in. So I would be fine with points adjustments. I would be fine with a brand new ability. Brand new ability would take way more work, so points adjustments are what we need, but either one needs something, right? Now, armored mid-rangers are another real problem because defensive elites have just always been bad. This is how, when second edition started and people talked about, every move 3 fighter is busted, and then they tried everything and they found out, oh wow, Nurgle Rotbringers really isn't busted. And that's because they are defensive elites. They don't score points on objective missions because objectives reward having numbers. And so if you can't put a lot of numbers down, then you need to kill your opponent to make their numbers go down to your level, right? And defensive elites are not there to kill their opponent. They're there to not die. And Nurgle is really good at moving forward and not dying with their guys, but you don't score any points that way. And so you don't kill anything. They eventually drop two of your guys. So if it's a kill mission, they drop the two guys that are going to get them points. And then, they don't take out half your warband, but that doesn't matter to you because you've not killed any of their guys. They've killed one or two of yours, and you lose the kill mission. And then you lose the objective mission because you don't have very many bodies. So it doesn't work out. And the same is true of every type of Chaos Warrior, whether it's Blood Warriors, or, if you bring like a bunch of Twin Souls in Slaanesh. Tzeentch doesn't really have an equivalent of this. But all of these really struggle, and all of the ones in like Untamed Beasts, or all of the sort of bespoke warbands that kind of go along on these fighters. I'm like trying to find one nearby, but all I've got is a Blood Warrior. But all of these warbands that rely on these mid-range sort of buffed up humans, none of them are good because none of these fighters can do their job. They die in one hit to things like Gutlords, Vexmores, Fomo Crushers, and they also just can't get enough bodies on the board to kill chaff. I think that a big part of the reason why Hordes are so good is because Blood Warriors are so bad. Because if you did have 4 of these in a list that, probably also had 3 of these, but if you were legitimately wanting to play equal numbers of both, you would have a list that would chop down chaff really quickly if this guy was correctly pointed, because his job is to do about that much damage, just not in one hit, over like a few hits, right? But you'd have a couple of them. They wouldn't get a kill early, but then the damage would kind of overwhelmingly crash through over time, right? Instead, that doesn't happen. They become unplayable and you just can't use them. That's too bad. I think it would be really nice to see those kinds of Chaos Warrior equivalents kind of buffed up. Destruction has a few of these too. Like I think we've seen what Iron Jaws looks like with the new Ardboy's profile, which the new Ardboy is basically just a Chaos Warrior. And I think it's time now we can all admit, I hope, this was something that I was, I was actually really happy about, that Iron Jaws got such a huge nerf when they got reworked. But I think a lot of people were really, really sure that Iron Jaws had been buffed, actually. And those people were not right. Iron Jaws is perfectly balanced right now. They're fine, but they're not good. They're not sort of dictating the meta at all. And the reason for that is because they do kind of have to rely on a Chaos Warrior. Now, all their other abilities are so good, maybe you don't want to nerf the Ardboy, maybe they'd go right back to being a problem. But every other kind of Chaos Warrior-based faction, I think, could really use some help. Even the ones that are good. So, for example, Khorne is just fine. But Khorne is fine because Blood Reavers are great. You never see more than one Blood Warrior, and it would be cool to do that. It'd be cool to feel like you can make a list like that. Now I have non-net control. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people talk about other than me. People talk about elves being terrible all the time. Sometimes you'll see people complain about how bad mid-range bespoke people are. Oh, by the way, abilities. We have seen this issue fixed. So, for example, Cruel Boy's Monster Killers has some mid-rangers that just have more interesting abilities, like the Bonesaw one, that make them much more playable. And I think that that's proof that you can fix mid-range fighters by just giving them really good abilities that aren't force multipliers, that instead deal with the opponent. The problem is you can't just make every single one of these ability based, right? Like you could say the Ardboy is fine and balanced because it has such busted abilities, but the Blood Warrior's abilities are terrible. So you either make it a new ability that's really busted, but then all of them are just based on abilities. And when you make something good because of an ability, it means the second one you put in your list is bad because you're really only using the ability once. So that's just a different type of balancing knob to turn that doesn't make a fighter necessarily a good backbone piece for a warband, but can you make them good as a one-of. Now on to non-net control. Nets are really good. I'm not calling to nerf nets right now, but it would be so nice to have there be other ways we can interact with our opponent other than just netting them. I am sick of watching the life drain from my opponent's eyes because I have taken their coolest, best painted fighter in their warband and said it doesn't get to do anything this turn, and then Shank does a little dance. I hate that. I hate playing that way. I hate seeing what it does to people. But I also hate it when someone just kind of runs roughshod with their stupid giant offense piece, their +1A FOMO Crusher, their +1A Gut Lord, and it just kind of single handedly wins the game by just rampaging around. I hate that. So I'd love there to be different ways to interact with people, to different ways to lessen the effectiveness of certain fighters. Things like the Night Relictor, the Swamp Color Shaman, the Sonari Caligrave, the Issuran Tidecaster, the Shrewmancer from Gobapalooza should have been here. There's a lot of these fighters that have these really cool abilities that just don't get played. You don't even see them in casual play because they're just not compelling, because they're just priced out of being playable. And I think that's really too bad, and I would like to see that. Vashtis is the only one that's really competitively priced. And Vashtis kind of makes list building frustrating and chaos because every time I want to bring a cool support wizard, I just look at it and then I look at Vashtis and that's it, you know? So I'd love to see some of these sort of disruptive pieces actually be kind of playable other than just, you know, nets and more nets. Yeah, it would be really nice. I just think nets are an incredibly unfun way to play control. Faction buffs, everyone's favorite. This is the thing that gets people going the most. Corn is in such a bad place other than Blood Reavers. It's like this one model is the one model that's holding up an entire faction into playability. An entire Chaos God is just usable because of just this one guy. That's not entirely true. Korgoraths are really good, but it's mostly him. Demons, Corn Demons just need hero abilities. I'd love to see 5 points back on Bloodletters, but just the profiles for the points on Corn Demons aren't awful. The problem is your only ability is this one double on a fighter that's not efficient enough to take more than one of in your warband, which is the Fleshhound. And so then you just have nothing you can do, and Bloodletters aren't like, they are embarrassing, but they're not so bad you couldn't have a warband around them. The problem is that Bloodletters aren't efficient and there are no abilities, so there's just nothing you're really doing. And so if you did have actual leader abilities, something that maybe makes your Bloodletters better, that would allow you to kind of actually have real play to Corn as opposed to just kind of standing there doing nothing with your dice. And that would be nice. Claws of Karanak don't need abilities. They have a really cool gimmick. The problem is that all of their points are just way too high. Every single fighter in that warband needs to come down 10 points, and some of them need to come down more than 10 points. So that's something that just can be fixed with points. Gloomspite Gitz is so weird. Look at the Stab Grot profile, and then look at the Stab a Wish Shield profile. I'll either remember to put them into this video, or you can just go to Warcry. They shouldn't be 10 points different. Both of those should be 50 points. Stab Grots are 5 points too cheap. Stab a Wish Shield is 5 points too expensive. There's a whole bunch of fighters in Gloomspite Gitz that are just kind of an embarrassing mismatch of wounds to point value that just kind of needs to change. Some of it's hard. Like, I don't know if there's a points cost where fanatics are reasonable because they're so skewed because they do really good damage, but they have no wounds. So it's like, what is the points cost where fanatics, if you have 2 of them in your list, you don't just auto lose to shooting? I don't know. Is it good for the game to have such skewed profiles like that? Maybe. I would say yes, but is it good for the game to have super skewed profiles like that be one of the best things in the game? Definitely no. This is kind of the Cypher Lord's problem too, where I think, you look at how much, like the ridiculous amount of damage that Mirror Blades do, and then how few wounds they have, and it's like, you can't point them really cheap because then having that much damage on such a cheap fighter is like wildly unreasonable. But then you can't, as soon as you point them expensive, it makes them unplayable because they die so quick, right? And there's just like a world where Cypher Lords are the best thing in the game is just an awful world to live in because of how skewed they are. And so you just end up pointing them really conservatively, and then Cypher Lords just ends up being bad, which is tough. So I like there being ridiculously skewed profiles for people who are into that, but it does create this kind of catch-22 of what do you want the good things in the game to be, and they probably shouldn't be that hyper skew stuff. Gloomspite has a really tough time with that because a lot of their profiles are just weird. Um, but I think that because of that, we can take some of the less weird profiles and make them a little bit better. Making Mollog good was a great start. I don't think it's Mollog's fault that Gloomspite is having a low win rate. I think that you can build really good lists with Mollog. I also watched a really interesting Honest Wargamer Rob video today that talked about how Gloomspite gets players are a very specific kind of insane that drags the Gloomspite win rate down. And he was just saying Gloomspite is really good, but their win rate's low because when you look at the lists that get made versus the lists that are good, almost none of the lists are like the lists that are good. And that can be kind of true with Gloomspite. There was a really big tournament in the UK that a gentleman, I think his name was John Buckland, or was it Jack Buckland? But he brought a really nicely put together Destruction Soup list that used Gloomspite as the base. And he went 3-1 and, had a chance to win the tournament. And I think that that's a really good lesson here, that you can make good Gloomspite lists. You can't make top tier Gloomspite lists right now. But even if we fixed Gloomspite, would they still be terrible? Because our Gloomspite player is too insane. That's sort of a philosophical question that I can't answer in such a short video that is already ballooning to be too long. A lot of the other bad factions, like a lot of the elves, would be caught in structure buffs as far as figuring out what the points are supposed to be on an 8-wound fighter. Darkling Coverings have proven that you can make elves good. The question is about sort of damage chaff versus non-damage chaff. So part of what is good about Darkling Coverings is their really cheap elves are actually defensive elves. They don't really do much damage. They've got armor on. Yes, they still only have 8 wounds, but they aren't trying to get kills. They're just trying to run around and survive. And that makes them pretty good. That's not going to work with, the more offensive builds. That's never going to work with Namarti Thralls. So, that's a separate thing we have to decide. The last thing for faction buffs, though, is the final 4. I actually think that Tyrannic Cohort have an incredibly cool gimmick. Their cool gimmick doesn't always mathematically make sense. Sometimes throwing a wild dice is so valuable, and I watch Tyrannic Cohort players do it anyway because it's the thing their faction does. And the big thing in Tyrannic Cohort is really all about having the discipline not to burn your wild dice. And it is a shame right now that I think the most powerful thing you can do in Tyrannic Cohort is play them as Soulblight Gravelords, where you just bring in the broken Soulblight Underworlds teams that need to be nerfed. I guarantee you Exiled Dead doesn't get nerfed in the next FAQ, and you will see me with a placard saying Nerf Exiled Dead in every video. I'm just going to hang it like right over there or right over there. Look, that paint rack is empty anyway. I moved all the paints upstairs. Why don't I just replace that paint rack with a big plaque that says Nerf Exiled Dead? Other than that, the best way to play Tyrannic Cohort is to use their ability that harvests wild dice and then bring in the Exiled Dead and then just use the wild dice on triples for the Exiled Dead because their Arc Zombie ability and their Resurrection ability is so strong that they're better at using dice than the Tyrannic Cohort are, because like what I said, their gimmick is really, really cool, but it is mathematically not worth itself. They're so good at generating wild dice, but then there are just those wild dice can do more powerful things than what they do inside the Tyrannic cohort abilities, which means I think the points need to go down a little bit, and then their battle trait just needs to be reworded and made good. And as long as their battle trait is good, then you have two different builds that you can do for them. You can do bring in allies and use the busted wild dice generation to supercharge an ally ability, or you can use whatever the battle trait would be and make that like its own whole build. And then you have two valid ways that are both really competitive to play Tyrannic cohort, and everyone is happy. That's what I would like to see for them. Pyregeists, uh, listen, their shtick is really cool with the flambe tokens, but the numbers on them are not great. But you can still do them. You just need all the points to come down on all of the fighters, and then you have stuff. It's unfortunate, well, it's not unfortunate because it's a cool ability. If you bring all the fighters' points down, probably the thing that is powerful is the if you get a kill, you get to do the Calthea Zandire thing. Is that what we want? I think it's a fine place for them to be. I think the Calthea Zandire ability is one of the most fun abilities in the game. But that's where we're at with Pyregeists. They're another candidate for kind of tweaking their abilities a little, but I wouldn't want to see much because I think their shtick is really, really cool. Twistweld need a complete ground-up rework. All of their abilities are so bad, and their profiles are generally not good either. Some of them are okay, like the leader is only a little bit overcosted. The guys with the halberds are which one is it? The revenants that have big weapons. All three of them are just like barely overcosted. They're too fragile for what they're doing right now, but they're only just barely overcosted. They're a little bit like, that Cypher Lord's Fanatics problem where they're too fragile for how much damage they do. So it's like you kind of have to point them conservatively. But because of that, I'd like to see, repointing, reapproaching on some of the other fighters. I think, Twistweld basically, that box is worth 800 points. Honestly, the fighters in it. You could go one box with that, and if you went against competitive 800-point lists, you'd have really close games. That's how overpointed they are. And it's because the abilities are so bad, but because they're like overwritten. I know I've said that a lot of the later designs are some of their best designs, but the Twistwell's abilities are just, whoever was typing them just couldn't stop their fingers from moving and just put too many words, and the words weren't good and they weren't useful and it didn't turn out good. All of that just like didn't work out. It's not compelling. So that's why I think a ground up rework is needed. I think even each fighter should probably get a brand new profile. These guys are made of wood. Why are they so fragile? Like, wood is really hard to chop down. It's not just like, wood is not as hard as like metal armor, but guess what's under the armor? Squishy flesh. Guess what's under the wood? More wood. All the people who are just made of wood should be really hard to kill. The bodies are ghost bodies, right? You shouldn't be able to, well, Nighthaunt is really fragile for some reason, despite being ghost bodied. But anyway, blah, blah, blah. Riverblades could be busted with a 5-point drop on the chaff. That's all they would need to just be all of a sudden really good. But that version of the warband is incredibly uncompelling. Basically, it would just be the leader who gets swift as the wind, a bunch of chaff, and then you would just bring in like as many cheap, like efficient move 3 guys as you can to just like draft off the leader. Like the Fire Slayers, Underworld Warband isn't that good, but Dwarf Underworld's warbands would be really good in there, for example. Or you'd bring in like the move 3 Stormcast big guys and sort of slingshot them around the board. And that would just be a ridiculously powerful warband that no one except for me would like. So I think they need a new shtick. It's just pretty much all bad other than just having released the river. Their double is okay, but not like good. It's just too low impact to be good. Having a warband whose thing is our profiles are already fast, and we all have movement abilities, that is not a warband. That's a theme, but that theme doesn't correlate to anything on the board. If you're already fast enough to get to wherever you need to go, having another move ability on top of that just doesn't do anything, right? So having River Blades have some kind of way to either have teeth or have survivability is pretty necessary, and they don't have that right now, and that's too bad. You could try to adjust their mid-sized guys, right? Buff the abilities on the mid-sized guys and then also drop their points, and that would probably make them pretty compelling as a team. You'd end up getting like their points out of a box down to like 920. You replace one guy with an interesting ally. You have, otherwise you still have a ton of bodies, and then maybe you've got something interesting there if the mid-sized guys have a good ability or just like are much cheaper. But in general, as they are now, they just need total brand new reworks. So that's kind of my long, pointless rambles on how I see the structure of the game and what I would love to see out of what's going on. I'm looking forward to doing a video where I more celebrate what's cool instead of complain about what needs fixing, because I do think there's a lot of really cool things in Warcry right now, but it's no secret that the competitive meta is in a good place, but an old place that's been sitting for a long time. And while the competitive meta is in an okay spot, I do think that the LGS meta is in a really terrible spot because of how bad some of the sort of poster factions of Warcry have been. And that is something that I would really love to see fixed in an FAQ, more even than the competitive stuff. Although, Shank just needs to be taken out. Shank is way too good. And I say this as someone who plays Shank. I went 4-0 in a tournament just last month with Shank. Or is this? I'm old and time runs weirdly for me. I think that was actually 2 months ago. But either way, I just won a tournament with Shank in my list. I know very much how he's way too good. But yes, there are competitive things that need to be touched, even though the competitive, scene is pretty good. Like, for example, last December, in those sort of very innocent days when I thought there might be an FAQ in April, I made a video called Don't Nerf Me, Bro, about how cool the S tier was in Warcry at that time. And it was basically a call for like, please make your nerfs to the best stuff very small. And I still feel that way because I do think that mostly the competitive meta in Warcry is really good. Most of the really busted factions in Warcry are incredibly compelling. They're just a little overtuned compared to what most stuff is doing. So I do hope that nerfs to the top stuff is really small. And I hope that we really think about like the main changes that we see are towards the LGS meta or the casual meta, because, there are some factions that the average player was sold as being a great way to start playing Warcry that are just not a compelling way to start playing Warcry. And that's really too bad. So with all that, I hope that you get some games in before the FAQ. I hope you get one last game in with Shank before the terrible drubbing that he is bound to get. And when you do, I hope all that your rolls are crits. Watch me say all this and then Shank doesn't get touched in the next FAQ. That'd be hilarious.